my kind of presentation is going to be rather more narrow, focusing more on particularly on coal-based power plants and their kind of how they'll be changing within the power sector when we're talking about it through the lens of the transition. This conversation kind of is valid under the context of this energy transition that we're talking about, moving away from coal and towards renewables. And this graph is kind of pulled from CEA's optimal supply mix report for 2030. And this kind of highlights the fact that while we're talking about an increase in renewables in terms of installed capacity, your coal is still going to kind of contribute to a majority of generations even in 2030. Dr. Sheshadri also made this point that coal is going to continue playing a role even if renewables increase. So the conversation that I want to highlight here is what do we do to improve that role it's going to play. So I'll be, again, very broad even within this scope, but two aspects of it that I would like to focus on is the operational aspects of it, is how do we optimize the role of coal, and addressing some climate concerns. Though Mr. Daya has made my job a lot easier, covered a lot of those points, so I can kind of brush over some of those. With regard to optimizing the role of coal-based power plants, we're talking about this new era where we have more alternate power supply options with renewables increasing, but we're also talking about different demand patterns that we didn't have to kind of foresee or predict decades ago. We're talking about more EV penetrations, increased cooling, shifting of agricultural demand, and not to mention weather patterns are changing, therefore that also affects demand. So it won't do for coal to operate in the way that it was designed to operate. So hitherto, the way we've looked at coal, it's been required to operate as this base load round-the-clock supply. That was the mainstay of the sector entirely. But now going ahead with the focus on renewables and dependence on renewables, we're going to need coal to shift into a more dynamic supply option or a swing generator to address the demand when renewables aren't able to do so. Right? Now, it's not to say that flexibilization does not exist in the sector right now. It does. And both steps have been taken towards flexibilization, and flexibilization has also been kind of like a byproduct of some action. Won't go into too much details about that, but we've seen CA come out with some technical flexibilization parameters. So talking about a lower technical minimum of operation so as to help with grid integration better. Also in certain states, regulations incentivize ramp rates, the kind of increasing and decreasing of ramp rates. So those technical incentives kind of highlight that importance of flexibilization. Similarly, there are also other regulatory operational flexibilizations that are present in certain regulations, such as operation during peak hours is you can recover more of your costs during those times as opposed to other times. And there are already provisions existing for unrequisitioned power to be traded. So there are those measures of flexibility. But given that coal-based power was kind of designed to operate in this stable and rigid fashion, those issues still kind of run through now. And we see that especially in the nature of the contracts that govern this. I'll go into a little more detail on that in the next slide. And also the existing measures that I just kind of listed are vastly underutilized. So we recognize that such flexibilization is going to be complex and highly disruptive, but it is a necessary kind of bullet to bite. And right now, all of these steps that are somewhat ad hoc and emerging as the need emerges are kind of band-aid solutions. But what is needed now is a more kind of system-level approach to consideration of flexibilization. But it is one of the major aspects of this complexity is that a majority of the existing coal-based power plants are already contracted, so they have contractual obligations that bind them. So such changes cannot kind of affect those existing contractual structures. But we can think about, since for better or for worse, we do have coal-based capacity in the pipeline. So maybe we can think about being more innovative and bolder when we think about flexibilization for that capacity. So with regard to the existing capacity, which is the majority of the capacity that we'll be discussing with regard to coal, right now, the incentivization structures or the operational structures that govern it is such that more generation is better. So in your regulations, and so if you generate more than the norm that is there, you're incentivized. But going ahead, that is not what we will need from coal. We will need coal to generate when we need coal, as opposed to just generally when demand is higher. So we need more targeted incentivization. Like I mentioned earlier, a strengthening of existing measures. So with regard to that first point of optimized incentivization, we don't really have to reinvent the wheel. There are existing provisions that more recently in tariff regulations, we've seen that, so for peak hours, there's a consideration of peak hours. And when you operate during those peak hours, you can kind of have more of your cost recovery that happens during that time. So we've kind of suggested in our more recent regulatory engagement and one of our recent reports, what we've kind of done is like a +1 of that approach, where you not only consider this differentiation of peak and off-peak powers, you also bring in the difference in demand across seasons. So you, in that system, you would basically have the most demand during your peak hours and high demand season. And therefore, you would have most of your cost recovery and most of your incentivization for generation during that time, as opposed to the rest of the year, right? Now, but for this to work, like I said, it is going to be, incentivize coal to generate more when you need coal more. So these definitions of high demand season and peak hours needs to happen on the basis of net load, or that is the demand that coal needs to address after when solar and wind cannot do so. Right? As of now, in the regulations and all, it's just based on general demand, but this needs to shift to incentivizing coal when coal is required, when RE is not available. Right. Another kind of important measure that can be done by pushing the existing provisions that exist is with regard to scheduling. So currently, distribution utilities have contracted capacities from various generators, and as and when they need it on a day-ahead basis, they're required to schedule which of these capacities they will be, running. But instead of doing this, by doing something comparatively low effort, is releasing this schedule with a kind of larger window of vision, like a fortnight ahead or a week ahead, gives generators that time to realize that, okay, all of my capacity is not going to be scheduled, therefore I can sell it in alternate kind of provisions. And then my distribution, the distribution utility then has a pressure to optimize their power procurement as well through market options or other kind of low price options, alternatives that exist. And as I mentioned earlier, unrequisitioned power, that is the power that you're not going to be using, that is, you've contracted it, but you're not going to be scheduling it, not going to be running it. That, so there are provisions. Distribution companies can sell it as traders, or generator companies can kind of sell it in the market, but these are not really utilized at all. But given that there is so much potential for it to be used, it could be used to address needs for other consumers when their demand is high but your demand is low. So it could even sidestep the need for more capacity additions. But so this requires more regulatory scrutiny, and data availability is a huge part in kind of pushing this ahead. Now, as I mentioned, for newer capacity, you can kind of go for bolder, more innovating contract structures. So right now, we've been thinking of coal as a base load capacity that needs to be running round the clock. But going ahead, if you don't need to only think of it in that way. You can think of non-RTC contracts. You can think of different capacities that you can contract from a single power plant, and you can kind of be a lot more bolder with it. Now, it is true that this rigidity that we saw in existing contracts had a role to play. It did provide financial, de-risk financial investments and make it attractive. And that was the need of the sector when it was emerging. But where we are now, that's not the reality of the sector anymore. The role of coal is changing. So while this may increase the risk of the investments, it also reflects the changing reality of the sector. And when we're talking about moving away from these long-term contracts and these kind of round-the-clock structures, we're going to see the need for more shorter-term contracting and shorter-term supplies. So markets are clearly going to have a larger role to play. So in the power sector side, we've seen this happen. There's real-time markets, day-ahead markets, and we have like all of those options already under development. But what we don't see is that the utilities and the actors in the sector who are required to engage with it don't have the capacity to do so to the extent that we need them to. So some capacity building on that front is important. Also, one kind of facet that's missing is that generation utilities, as we now see it, are usually thermal heavy. But going ahead, that needn't be the case. So generation utilities are also currently in their planning kind of short-sighted in what their role is likely to be 10 years into the future or 5 years into the future. So that is also a kind of aspect that needs to be thought about. Now, I spoke about all these flexibilization measures in the power sector. The coal sector and the power sector are so interlinked that you cannot talk about making one of them responsive while not addressing the rigidities in the other. Even as things stand, power sector is kind of leaps and bounds ahead in terms of responsiveness and dynamism in operation than the coal sector is. So the coal sector already has a lot of catching up to do. In addition to that, so like the power purchase agreements in the power sector are the major overarching rigidity element in terms of contracting, fuel supply agreements are in the coal sector. But the issue here is that while they are rigid, they also not adhered to. So there is a lot of avenue here to rethink contracting itself and kind of bring in elements of flexibility while also just improving efficacy of such contracting. I'm not going to go into the details over here. We can take it up if anyone has any bilateral questions. And the role of market even here. Right now, coal markets are not a thing, and but then commercial coal mines have started production recently, and so new players are entering the fray. So there is kind of a possibility or an avenue for shorter term sales and purchases. Now, so the thing, I mean, I don't have to make the case for why we have to look at environmental norms for thermal power plants. So like Mr. Dahiya said, a lot of these points, the fact that, thermal generation is a huge contributor to emissions, and but the power sector here also has a role to play. Because when you're talking about pollution control equipment, you're going to most likely require, when you talk about emissions, you're going to require some pollution control equipment investments, which are going to affect your final electricity consumer. So it's not just an environmental conversation there, it is also a power sector conversation to be had. But even power sector actors have not really played their role. When the first deadline, 2017, generators only approached the regulator literally after the 2017 deadline had passed. And this huge issue of lack of seriousness even in the deadlines, Mr. Dahiya had kind of gone into a more elaborate graph of how these deadlines kept moving. So what does that leave us with? So we're in 23, almost a decade since the norms were first introduced, and we have a very little portion of our whole total coal capacity that has FGD installed. Now bear in mind that this is FGD installed, it does not necessarily mean adherence to the norms. So we've kind of seen this whole, even though there's this existence of environmental norms and this whole conversation around curbing those emissions, we haven't really seen effective implementation on that front. We've seen lack of coordination across ministries on both sectors and their various institutions. There has been insufficient consultation with people on the ground. And there's also just been a lack of consideration of preemptive action. And across the board, and even after, there is also very minimal monitoring as to whether adherence is happening or not. So, in addition to some of the points that Mr. Dahiya said with regard to the issues that exist, one major one is that focus on implementation and not utilization. And also the fact that even regulators till date have not like across states haven't taken the cognizance of the impact of these environmental norms. And it also raises some ambiguities. So CA recently put up a notification about there'll be no retirement of thermal power plants till 2030. But you have your deadline in 2027. So what happens in those 3 years with regards to the environmental norms? And monitoring has improved from what we're talking about a couple of years ago, but it's still very lacking. So despite there being seeming to be so much kind of movement in the whole environmental norm space, how much action, it's actually been very insufficient action on this front. So to conclude, there is an energy transition underway, and we all recognize that there's going to be a reduced share of coal in the installed capacity, but it's still going to play a huge role when it comes to generation, but this role is going to shift in what we've seen it. So what we should think about is in the interim, where coal still has a role to play, how do we optimize its operation within the sector, and how do we address this kind of climate aspects of it?